All right, we're going to take a look at our next chapter, which is chapter 2. This takes us into the next real big development in our humanity's progress, which is the move towards settling down, getting away from hunting and gathering, which had kept us nomadic for so long, and thus we had never made it towards civilization, to eventually settling down, beginning to domesticate plants and animals, moving towards settled systematic agriculture, and hopefully the beginnings of civilization. So when you look through the chapter, all right, your goals for this chapter are to take a look at it. When you look at these, you're going to see what the chapter is after: warmer, more stable climate, settled communities, domestication, transition to agriculture, spread of agriculture, and how that affected us, how that affected our life and our lives and our culture. So as you go through the chapter, start seeing some of these environmental changes that are going on that are going to make it easier for us to begin to shift towards agriculture. And then you're going to start seeing that pop up all over the globe. It's important to remember, and you go back to that unit beginning video, this doesn't happen overnight. Nowhere in the world 30,000, 40,000 years ago did an early human roll out of bed one day and say, hey, I'm going to start farming. No, it is a transition. It is a long process. It takes us thousands of years to move from hunting and gathering to the point to where we can start establishing settled communities. We have to develop, domesticate both plants, animals, the land, to the point to where we can survive without having to hunt and gather. So that doesn't happen overnight, as you guys will find out. One of the things that had to change, all right, is some climate change. The last ice age took place from, was over by about 23 or so thousand years ago. And when the earth started to warm, then you started to see some major changes. The ice sheets melt, sea levels rise, land bridges that had been there before or disappear. Things get wetter, things get warmer. Okay, you have things start to that were normally not necessarily underwater begin to fill up. Okay, and you start to see a much more warmer climate. And that's the only way, of course, that we're going to eventually start to move towards agriculture. We've got to get a climate that will support that. The earth can still play mean tricks on us, okay? And sometimes the warming climate also set into motion other strange things. We believe, for example, our scholars believe that when North American lakes melted, glaciers in North America melted, it changed even the salt content of the oceans around that area, changed patterns, changed circulation patterns, and may even have led to a cold spell in the northern hemisphere. So the earth can still do strange things to us, and that'll be kind of a constant thing we have to deal with as we move towards civilization. But eventually, we're going to start making it, like we said, towards settlement. Okay, the first settlers maybe get lucky. Okay, they may have found places where animals were in abundance already, maybe even where animals could come to them. For example, maybe, you find a place like some of the settlements along the western coast of North America, the western coast of modern day, the United States, Canada, Alaska, even, where you had abundant fish, you had abundant wildlife, you had abundant, food sources there, which made it easy maybe to settle in those areas. Okay, so you could settle in an area where you could throw a net into a lake and get a salmon. Well, that makes life pretty easier or pretty easy there. And you don't necessarily maybe even have to dabble in agriculture if you have food sources that abundant. In the Pacific, you saw a culture develop in Japan. The Jomon culture in Japan also really had abundant supplies. They also were making pottery by about 13,000 years ago because they needed to store some of the foods that they were developing. And so they were able to use shellfish, things that were abundant in that area, to make them a little bit more sedentary to where they didn't have to kind of wander around. In modern day Turkey, you get Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is still a really mysterious place, and a people built a sort of a settlement in that area in southeastern Turkey, and it may have been a religious site. It is known for having a large stone temple. All right, it was, like we said, probably a religious site and along a trade route or something like that. It seems to have been abandoned in by about 7,000 BCE, and we don't really know why. Okay, today only a very small portion of the area has been excavated and has been studied, so it is a very, very mysterious sort of area, and it may, as more and more is known or becomes known about it, may even change some of our views about what things were going on there. In parts of what is today the modern day Ukraine, you had people that started to kind of settle in along the migratory patterns of the mammoth. So the mammoth hunters sort of found a place that the mammoths seemed to migrate around, and they just settled there. And when the mammoth came around, they killed a mammoth and used it to eat, to create their huts, and basically to create a society there. So this was probably happening probably about 27,000 years ago. These mammoth hunters stretched from basically France to about eastern Siberia. Archaeologists have uncovered really about 60, 70 or so mammoth huts, and they were what we would expect. As they got more and more settled, they started to do more and more artistic things. They made jewelry, they made statues, they made baskets, they made needles, and so they're starting to develop not only really a settled society, but also a sort of I hate to say, almost a monetary society, almost a wealth-based society, a stratified society, if you will. The reindeer hunters in where they sort of developed in and around France, and sort of the same thing. You end up with an area where the Magdalenians, they settled along the migratory patterns of the reindeer, and then they basically use them to help settle down and to help with their food supply. So when you look at the map, this is kind of the areas that we're talking about. Okay, you had the Magdalenians up here. You had the mammoth hunters sort of stretched out in here and all the way kind of through here. The Göbekli Tepe is right there. Okay, and so this is kind of some of the areas that we're talking about. Okay, settlement is an interesting thing. Sociologists talk about this a lot. You may have had more time, free time, leisure time, if you were a good hunting and gathering society, or one of these societies that sort of made that transition to being sedentary, not necessarily being agricultural yet, to being sedentary, than you may have had at any other time. When we get to agriculture, you're not going to see that. Okay, agriculture is tough. And so really, this may have allowed people to become a little bit more creative. They started using new technologies. The bow and arrow, for example, start to appear. You start seeing flints, obsidians, okay, and you also start seeing those things move, which indicates a little bit of trade that's going on. Okay, so that is kind of that interesting sort of beginnings of people settling down. The next thing we probably need to do, if we're going to kind of embrace this sedentary lifestyle, is to domesticate plants and animals. We need to start being able to produce our own food. And so really there are plants that we will continue to sort of embrace that helped us along the way. Corn is a good example. Okay, plants that evolved to sort of rely on us to help them survive. Corn won't really propagate on its own. It needs animals, it needs humans to help spread the seeds. And so corn is a great example of that, and how we will use corn as both the Native Americans here in North America and then other humans all across the globe will use really a derivative, some kind of derivative of corn to help them along with plant domestication and move towards agriculture. Somewhere probably around 30,000 years ago, we began to domesticate dogs. Dogs help people with hunting. Dogs would receive food and shelter, so they didn't have to have as tough of a life. So the partnership really between humans and dogs began maybe about 30,000 years ago. And believe it or not, scholars and scientists believe that you can even sort of trace that in our DNA, that dog DNA, human DNA actually changed a little bit because of that relationship. And it was a mutually beneficial society. Dogs were bred then by humans once we sort of got to that point to where we domesticated the dog. All right, we wanted dogs that were smarter, we wanted dogs that were loyal, and so we started to try to breed those characteristics into those dogs. And so ones that we of course were successful at, we were very good at train, or especially the dogs that we wanted them to train. We wanted them to be really to protect us, and we of course wanted to protect them. There's even evidence of us burying dogs along with us in human graves 14,000 years ago. So that partnership is a long-standing partnership. But eventually, like I told you guys, we are going to move towards farming. And only people that had started to settle are going to then start attempting to farm. First farming communities are going to appear maybe about 13,000 years ago in areas around the Fertile Crescent, which is the southwest, or an area in Southwest Asia. I'm going to show you in just a second. The communities, several farming communities actually appeared there at the same time, but it's going to happen all over the globe, but it's going to happen independently from one another. And like I told you guys, it is not an overnight sensation. It is going to take us hundreds and hundreds of years to eventually sort of perfect the techniques that are going to lead us into agriculture. The Fertile Crescent is this area that you sort of see from today, the modern-day Sinai Peninsula along Egypt near the Nile River here, and it stretches up and then around and down the Tigris and the Euphrates river valleys, and then out into what is today the Persian Gulf. And that is the Fertile Crescent. It is a microclimate. It's an area that not necessarily has the same weather patterns as the area around it. But you had areas here that had rich soils. You could grow grains like wheat and barley. You had the availability of animals that you could domesticate, herd animals like sheep, goats. And so this is one of the areas where you're going to start seeing agriculture develop first. And when we start to settle in those areas, we also start to domesticate farm animals. All right. By the way, for you cat lovers, cats were probably domesticated. And some people say 10,000 years ago. Mainly, we domesticated cats because when we started to eat grains, they attracted mice, and so we liked cats that tended to hunt the mice, and so that's where we started to protect cats and use them to help us as well. When we start to settle down, we start to develop new types of pottery. We start settling in larger areas. We start changing a little bit, and that's going to kind of make us into these agricultural societies start to develop some new practices. People learned which plants they wanted, how to really take care of those herds, enrich the soil, fertilize the soil with manure, and family units began to develop. So all that happens because of settlement. Okay, but you flip over to China, for example, and when you see agriculture develop in China, along the Yangtze and the Huanghe rivers, all right, this is totally different than what's going on in the Fertile Crescent. And there you're going to start seeing rice cultivation, which is very difficult. It's tough, okay? And because of the irrigation that you have to develop. In the Huanghe Valley in northern China, you started seeing millet, soybeans, by about 7,000, 6,000 or so BC. So very different, all right? The pigs domesticated in this region by about 4,500 or so BC. So in certain areas, we learned to take advantage of what was there. So you have rice in China, you have millet in China, but in the Fertile Crescent, you're going to have things like wheat and barley. We just kind of covered that. Okay. Moved down to Africa. 6,000 BC. Africans domesticate cattle in Egypt. Okay. And it's a little bit different in Africa. Plants kind of come second. Cattle was domesticated first, and then some of the other crops like millet and sorghum and then some rice as well were developed there. The probably climate change had a lot to do with that. For example, the Sahara wasn't always a desert. Okay, it tended to be it was a green area, but eventually, because of climate changes, when it starts to dry up around 4,500, between 8,000 and 4,500 BC, you get forced out of the desert because you can't survive there. All right. So, here in the Americas, remember me telling you about corn. All right, this is, of course, North American corn, which was referred to as maize, which began probably in western Mexico. In Colombia, in Ecuador, Peru, you had squash, beans. Probably in Peru is where the potato is domesticated between 8,000 and 4,000 BC. Oops, sorry. Went backwards there, sorry. And you have other crops that are going to become major crops. Of course, maize is probably the most important. So all of these areas where farming is developing, all right, whether it is grain in the Fertile Crescent or rice in China or maize and beans in Mesoamerica in the middle of America, you're going to eventually see farming develop all over these areas that we have seen, whether it's South America, North America, Africa, here in the Fertile Crescent, out here in the Yangtze Valley. Okay, all of those things, they are, and remember, each of these cases, all right, it takes thousands of years for these areas to develop. It doesn't happen overnight. We probably have women to thank for the development of agriculture. When we were hunters and gatherers, women tended to be the gatherers. And so they had probably done most of the research with plants and probably led the shift towards agriculture much probably more than men did. Okay, now there's no real direct evidence about this, but it probably, when you look at the way hunting and gathering societies operated, women knew more about food, about medicines that came from plants, fibers that came from plants. They knew which plants were advantageous, which ones to stay away from. And so it was them probably that led the movement towards agriculture. The sad thing is that as we became more and more agricultural and as we become more and more settled, women who had been relatively equal under or in a hunting and gathering society with men are going to kind of lose that place. We're going to become much, much, much more male-centered, male-driven, patriarchal later on as we become more and more settled. The agriculture, of course, is going to expand, right? And as it does, we change the environment. As we put more land under cultivation, we change the environment. As we start coming into close proximity with animals, we unfortunately end up sometimes getting exposed to different infectious diseases because of our association with animals. Okay, and but we are going to expand agriculture. What it does to us, it makes us gather together in more dense areas. It leads to diseases, especially because when we learn to use manure, we also expose ourselves to animal-borne diseases. Okay, women and children were the most vulnerable as we move towards farming. And of course, if we don't do it right, we end up with malnutrition, because you have groups that if they don't farm right, or you have a crop failure and you're not hunting and gathering and you don't have any kind of animals or any kind of plants to supplement, then you end up, of course, very hungry. It also is going to help pave the way for us to eventually start moving towards civilization. We really think that as we started to settle, you start seeing these things that are going to be really important in civilization show up. Social stratification, okay, the development of religion, okay, diversity, new architecture, new styles, new arts, okay. You're also going to start seeing the need to protect yourselves, because as you accumulate wealth and as you maybe become more and more successful, others who are around you are going to put pressure on you. And so you're going to need leaders. You're going to need militaries. And all those things are important as we start making that shift towards civilization. Okay. So this chapter, all about agriculture, all about the move towards agriculture. So as you read through this chapter, make sure that you understand that shift. It takes place really at the end of the Paleolithic period and this sort of shift towards the Neolithic period. Sometimes it's going to be referred to as the Neolithic Revolution. Now, revolution usually means change in a short period of time. But when you think about, we were hunters and gatherers for millions of years, and then eventually in a few thousand years, we're going to make the shift to agriculture. You could argue that that happens in a short period of time compared to what we've been doing for the rest of our existence. But it also gives you the wrong impression sometimes that we woke up one day and began to farm. That's not what happened. And it takes us a long time to get to this point. But once we do, we're going to be able to make that shift towards civilization. All right, so next chapter we'll talk more about that.